Thank you for coming to this session. My name is Alejandra Artiguez. I'm a compliance program manager for financial services at Amazon Web Services. Today in this session, we're going to focus on how financial institutions or regulated entities can move away from a point-in-time assessment or annual approach to audit to near real-time continuous compliance by using AWS services. Something important to understand is that moving your technology infrastructure to the cloud creates a shared responsibility model between the customer and the cloud service provider. AWS does the heavy lifting of managing and controlling the infrastructure and data centers, so you can focus your highly valuable IT resources in developing new applications that differentiate your business. In this distributed control environment, there are controls that customers fully inherit from AWS, such as physical security. There are controls that apply to both customer and AWS, but from different perspectives, like training employees on information security. And there are controls that are customer-specific, like deciding if you want to encrypt your sensitive data in your S3 buckets. From audit perspective, those controls that are customer responsibility are going to be validated by your internal audit team. And those that are AWS responsibility are continuously validated by independent third-party auditors. In line with this, AWS infrastructure and services are approved to operate under several compliance standards and industry standards across geographies and industries. AWS has certification for compliance with the family of ISO, with PCI DSS Level 1 on payment card standards, and many others. AWS has also system and organization control reports, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, available for our customers through AWS Artifact, which can be accessed by from your AWS Management Console. And this is not something only for global compliance programs. We also have some specific for Asia Pacific, for Europe, and for US. And why are those compliance programs important for financial institutions? Regulators like the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, have specified in their guidelines that financial institutions may rely on the audit opinion of service provider external auditors. AWS has more services and more features within those services than any other cloud service provider. At AWS, security will always be our top priority, and that's why we continue to release new services and features for security and for compliance across different capabilities. Identity for access control, detective control for visibility, monitoring, and logging, infrastructure security to shape your security controls in the cloud, data protection to have visibility and control over your data, and incident response to respond and restore operations during and after a security incident. I won't spend too much time going individually into each of these services, but I would like you to note that 90% of what we build at AWS is driven by what customers tell us matter, and the remaining 10% are things that maybe the customers don't articulate exactly what they want or what they need, but we try to read in between the lines to innovate on their behalf. So there are many things that you can do for compliance and for security, right? So where do you start? As a financial institution, you may be subject to a number of different regulatory requirements and legal requirements, depending on your industry and your jurisdiction. For example, here in Singapore, MAS has released a number of guidelines that provide a framework for financial institutions that are planning to use cloud services. The key two guidelines are MAS outsourcing guidelines and MAS technology risk management guidelines. And this is a trend that we see across Asia, where other regulators, like BSP in Philippines, BNM in Malaysia, or APRA in Australia, are releasing similar guidelines and similar requirements. In line with these regulatory requirements, financial institutions should internally establish policies, standards, procedures that are critical components of the framework to manage technology and to prioritize depending on your risk appetite. And something that we do at AWS is talking with customers around the world. And we know that implementing security controls to protect your sensitive data is not a simple task, right? So customers use common control frameworks such as NIST, CIS, or ISO 27001 to assess their IT security maturity and to set their goals. So what is the current approach for compliance and audit in a traditional environment? First, usually the business, audit, risk teams, they will identify the requirements, regulatory requirements and internal requirements that the institution needs to meet. In line with that, the audit team will develop an audit plan for the year, and for each audit, they will define the scope based on different criteria. For example, when was the last time that a server X or application X was validating in an audit? Or what is the business criticality for application Y? And I would like you to note that these audits are going to be executed in a point in time, and that the evidences collected are going to be for a period of time. So we are not talking about continuous assessment or audit here. Next step is sampling selection, which is going to be done based on a sampling methodology. For example, the audit team can select 30 samples if the control is manual, or maybe one sample only if the control is automated. And let me tell you a secret. I was an auditor before joining AWS, and I have seen many lists that were supposed to be manually updated, but for example, a server was replaced, and the inventory was never updated. So this is very challenging for auditors. Next step is evidence collection. But wait a second, the audit team, in many cases, doesn't have access to extract the evidences themselves. So they need to raise a ticket, ask for the file, for timestamp, for checksum to validate integrity. And now, finally, the auditor is ready to execute some testing. In the best case, computer-assisted audit techniques, CATs, are going to be used. And in the worst case, spreadsheets and manual validation are going to be executed. So let me ask you a question. How many of you here are still using spreadsheets and manual validation during their audits? OK, too many. So today, we're going to see how to remove some of these arduous steps. Moving away from that traditional approach to compliance and audit, there are two key benefits that you can achieve from moving your infrastructure technology to the cloud from a compliance and audit perspective. The first one is unprecedented visibility. With AWS, you have access to an accurate inventory of your resources. You can track the changes in the configuration of those resources. And you can log all the actions that are executed in your environment. So you will know who made what change to which specific resource and when. So this is very powerful. The second benefit is near real-time automation. With AWS, you are able to remediate a misconfiguration detected in near real time. So for example, one firewall has been, the configuration of the firewall has been changed, and you are able to detect and remediate to the previous state in seconds. So having both unprecedented visibility and near real-time automation allows you to assess and audit your AWS environment against your internal policies and guidelines. So I would like to show you an example of how this works and how this is possible and easy in AWS platform. So here we have a user, a technology user, who made a change. For example, disable the encryption in one of the storage volumes in an EC2 instance. With AWS CloudTrail, you can track all the actions executed in your environment. Those that are through the management console or SDKs or command line tools or AWS services. AWS Config provides you with a set of predefined rules, and you can also create your own custom rules. One of these predefined rules checks whether your storage volumes are encrypted. So with AWS Config dashboard, you will see that one of the resources is not compliant. In addition, in 2018 reInvent, AWS CEO Andy Jassy announced AWS Security Hub. AWS Security Hub provides you with a comprehensive overview of your high-priority security alerts. And you can also see compliance status across AWS accounts. So using any of those services, your compliance team will see that a resource is not compliant, and then they will decide what to do. So they could use Amazon Simple Notification Service to push a notification like an email to the administrator. Or they could use CloudWatch events to create events, to track metrics, to record the logs, and also execute a specific code that you want to execute for this misconfiguration using AWS Lambda function. So I would like to dive a bit deeper for this AWS service, AWS Config. With AWS Config, you have access to an accurate inventory of your resources, so this is not manually updated. You have access to, you can track the changes in the configuration of your resources and the relationship between your AWS resources. And you can also assess your compliance status against your configuration of the guidelines, against your guidelines and policies. So how to do this is using AWS config rules that are key component of AWS config. As I say, you have a set of predefined rules, and you can also create your own rules. And a game changer is that AWS config has the capability to link auto-remediation actions with your rules that we will see later. And you can also combine with AWS Lambda functions to auto-remediate. So going back to my audit background, I believe this functionality is very important. AWS Config has a compliance history. So, well, I think everyone here, or you are auditors, or you have been audited before, right? So we are humans, and we know that when the audit team is coming to execute an audit, we do like when our family-in-law is coming to our house, we try to clean everything as fast as we can. So moving away, like moving the humans from the data and from the evidences, AWS Config provides you with a compliance history, so you can see that a resource is not only compliant today, but over a period of time. So this is very useful for auditors. Well, how does it work? I have selected three requirements from the MAS TRM guidelines. The first one is you need to protect your data, and confidential information should be encrypted. The second one is you need to have strong password controls. And the third one is that you need to protect your network, so you need to have firewall or similar measures. How this will be audited in a traditional environment? So the audit team will probably have a walkthrough to understand the process. They will obtain the policies and procedures, and then they will request for a screenshot from the system or samples to validate against those policies, procedures, and understanding. At AWS, everything's our APIs, application programming interface. This is the way to communicate with computing resources. Every action and every command that runs as an API. So for the first example, we could execute this command to describe the volume. So we will see the volume ID, volume state, but most importantly, we will see if the volume is encrypted. For the second example, we can obtain the password policy by running this command. And for the third one, we can obtain the security group information, like security IP ranges, port, protocol, by running this command. So at AWS, security groups work like firewall, providing security at the port and protocol access level. But of course, we don't want to run a command every time we want to validate something. So we can configure some config rules to do this periodically or when there is a change in the configuration of the resource. So in this screenshot, you will see that one of my resources is not compliant because the volume is not encrypted. You can also see that my password policy is not in line with the password that I have configured in my config rule. But you can see that my security groups are appropriately configured. That means that they don't allow incoming traffic to the ports that I described in the config rule. And now, auto-remediation is even easier at AWS. AWS Config has the capability to link a set of actions, auto-remediation actions, with your config rule. So in this case, I will have a config rule that check if my S3 bucket is encrypted. And if it's not encrypted, it will run this auto-remediation action. So as you can see, it's very easy to configure auto-remediation now with AWS Config. And someone who knows how to approach compliance for highly regulated workloads in the cloud is Clara, Head of Technology and Operations at RHB Bank. So please join me to welcome her to the stage. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Alejandra. So good to see so many of you here today. Short introduction. My name is Clara. I'm Head of Technology and Operations in RHB Bank, Singapore. RHB Bank is the 4th largest bank in Malaysia. Our group has presence in 10 countries in the ASEAN. We have been in Singapore for 58 years, actually, and we have 7 branches across the country. And we provide services for our customers covering financial services, personal finance, wealth management, asset management, brokerage, commercial and corporate, the full suite. So in Singapore, RHB Singapore, we started our cloud journey 2 years ago because we wanted to transform and to reimagine something that we do love so much, including everyone here, and that's traveling the world. So we wanted to create a product that will make travel hassle-free, safe, and a rich experience. First, by eliminating the worry that we have of having too little foreign currency when you're abroad or too much of it when you return. But that means we need a highly scalable app. So we do what we normally do in IT, right? We go out, do some TCO assessment, and we compare on-prem, and we compare on-cloud versions. And it turned out that we find that we could build such an app 4 times cheaper, 3 times faster if we build it on cloud. But the problem is, RHB Singapore, in Singapore, we are and have been a bystander to technology advances for so long, including cloud technologies. So what to do, right? So agility and cost, to us, definitely are very compelling factors. But operating in a highly regulated environment as a bank, compliance, security, and resiliencies are our top priorities. So we spent the next 12 months working very closely with AWS, basically learning and understanding how we can operate on cloud in a very secured and scalable way. We will share more about this later. So it is a very enormous step for RHB Singapore, and we developed a cloud adoption framework together with AWS. We actually went through a series of programs to engage all stakeholders, both in group and in Singapore, even before we start getting approval. The objective here is to get executive alignment, to get buy-in from all our stakeholders, including, of course, lastly, the support of our regulators from both jurisdiction, Malaysia and Singapore. All of which are very key to our final decision to deploy a very first mobile app built in Singapore fully on cloud. We are blessed by support all around, especially from our board of directors. And so finally, in February 2018, we started to build up our landing zone and the first mobile app in Singapore, both at the same time. So by May, we have our landing zone, and 5 months later in September, we successfully launched our first mobile app in Singapore. Very exciting journey. But in the process, we also learned that we can do many, many things that we find that we take a lot of time to do if we are trying to do on-prem, and including in areas including audit and compliance. Take, for example, we coded some of our policies in AWS Config, like what Ellie showed us earlier. Config continuously monitor and record our AWS resources configurations. And it allows us to automate the evaluation of this recorded configuration against our desired configurations. And we can then review changes in our configuration, we can deep dive, and we determine our compliance against our configurations that is specified in our internal policies. Fantastic, right? Regulatory compliance becomes more automated, more visible, and we're very excited to look forward to AWS, the new competency in be able to automate remediation and even self-heal. So very exciting stuff. And from here on, we have not looked back from since. So after the launch of our very first app, we went on to deploy our new corporate web page on AWS, and also some non-production workload on AWS. In 2019, this year, we intend to keep up our velocity in our cloud adoption effort. So we're working very closely with AWS today and sourced, group our partner, to assess our readiness to migrate more workloads on cloud. We're quite sure in the very near term we will still be operating in a hybrid architecture, but we are really excited and looking forward and see where we will land in the next 12 to 18 months. This is our dream, this is our plan, and we are still very psyched. So let's come back to the very first workload that we built on AWS, and that's TravelFX. We will use this example as a case study and share with you our compliance landscape in RHB Singapore. This very first workload that we actually deploy is not the usual non-production or web page that most would choose to as their first workload on AWS. Why? It's because we see that our strategic starting point to get approval is a consumer app, and a consumer app that will transform and digitize a customer experience. So instead, we choose a very complicated and customer-fronting app. And this is TravelFX. Some may already know this product. If you do not know, TravelFX is the app that supports a multi-currency e-wallet with a Visa prepaid card. So it allows the customer to convert currency wherever they want, whenever they want to, top up wallets from any, whatever account they have with any fast bank, be able to cash out all your currency, every single cent if you really want to. What the app does not ask you to do is to come to the branch, visit a branch, open an account, maintain a minimum balance, pay ATM fees. That we don't do, right? Good product, great value proposition to the customers. The only problem is that such an app has a lot of functionalities. So we quickly come to realize that if we want to build every component ourselves in-house, given that Singapore does not have a wallet system, we do not have a card system, it's going to take a lot of time, too much time, and too much cost. So we definitely know that we cannot go with a monolithic architecture on an app. We have instead gone with a microservice-based architecture. We brought in third-party external platform providers that bring in a wallet platform, a card system, BKYC, and even FX rates. And so you see we have multiple platforms to orchestrate and integrate back into what we would have built ourselves. It's complicated to orchestrate all of these through a back-end API calls. And you will see that then data will be multiple. We have data coming in flight from multiple platforms. But we have to manage them very, very securely. And that's the difficult part. And of course, we also augment with many native AWS services. So all interactions are encrypted in motion, and all the data sitting and residing in cloud are automatically encrypted using AWS KMS services, and we control the encryption keys in-house. You can see up there that we use quite a number of AWS native services. With TravelFX, we have actually gone beyond virtualization, and we have adopted serverless technologies such as Lambda. Just in TravelFX itself, we have at least about 17 functions in Lambda. We also subscribe to high-value services like RDS. And with RDS, we actually reduce significantly our manpower, our efforts in database management. Now, we don't do all these, right? Don't install our own databases. We don't do all these anything like this. What we do is now we focus on building features, more features on TravelFX, and build a better and better app for the customer. Other than that, the last one is that for an app such as TravelFX, which is really meant to acquire a large user base, we need to be able to scale to whatever volume we needed. And so we apply concepts of auto-scaling so that we can practically scale to whatever volume that we wanted. And of course, scaling down is just as effective. The key point here is pay per user. So fantastic. We love what we now can do because we can do so much more on cloud. But all of these must operate in a very highly secured and compliant environment. So we recognize very, very early that we will have to invest in a strong foundation. We have to invest in a highly compliant landscape. Even before we start building our very first app, we recognize that. And what we did is we constructed a landing zone right up front that incorporated concepts of compliance and securities that a bank would need to operate in a very highly regulated environment. And we worked for many, many months with our partner Source Group. Today, we have, and we are happy to have our partner Source Group with us today. And I will invite John from Source Group to come join me on stage to share more details on the compliance landscape in RHB. John Painter, Source Group, everyone. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Clara. I really appreciate it. Absolute pleasure to work with RHB, and I think what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time explaining with some technical depth how the compliance and security landscape was actually delivered to RHB. Some really interesting notes before I go into the specific implementation details. I think a lot of financial services organizations and highly regulated organizations face some very specific challenges in the industry. Most financial service organizations are running a very broad and horizontal portfolio of applications as opposed to just one single application. And the other key element is usually multi-jurisdictional elements. So even across multiple countries or perhaps many regulators, both external and internal policy as well, that has to be complied with. So what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time giving you some specific detail on how RHB achieved their compliance landscape, and I hope it can serve as a benchmark of taking into your own organization. So I'm going to start with the primitive elements as accounts and identity access management and networking. So the first thing is that there's a landscape of accounts, pre-production, prototype, learning, et cetera, and all those accounts required a specific security baseline that configured things like the baseline IAM policies, things like the baseline networking connectivity elements required by the bank, and also the activation of all the compliance services that Ali just talked about. So things like config need to be turned on, activated, and configured. Things like VPC flow logs are essential to understanding your network traffic. And other services such as CloudTrail also need to be activated and configured to talk to a specific area. So in RHB's case, the creation of what we call the compliance account, or you could call it a security account, which is a central sinkhole for all compliance material. Now, there are some great features of S3 that can remove the ability for anyone to delete data out of that specific bucket. So think of it as an immutable, unlockable store of all of your central compliance data for your organization. Flowlog, CloudTrail, et cetera, et cetera. The next thing you can do is also do some interesting things with this bucket. You could replicate it out to multiple teams. So let's say you had a team that wanted to do analytics around your security posture, or another team that wanted to look at service requests and network traffic. S3 has all kinds of fun options that you can use for replication for multi-team functionality or multi-team uses. Excuse me. The last thing here is it also allowed us to maintain this baseline. So when we talk about creating accounts, one of the things, a term that you may hear is like the account sprawl, which is lots of people opening up accounts. Now, that's fantastic, and we want to get to a position where we could almost get to a landscape where every single application and every single developer has an account. right, for learning or for actual building prototype applications or building production applications as well. However, those accounts must have this baseline defined. So this is a real-world example of how that's configured. Central compliance accounts that have central sinkholes for all those compliance material. And making sure that all the accounts that are provisioned by RHB fall into that particular compliance landscape. A fun little top trick that I've learned in my years on how to do this is if you actually are looking at your Exchange servers and you're looking at the emails that are created through account generation, that gives you the ability to look at all of the account sign-up emails, and you can actually then direct it to the right team that can help them onboard a compliant, secure account. Now, I would say this landscape has been drastically simplified with the launch of Control Tower and services like Security Hub in the recent months. So Jassy announced Control Tower at reInvent this year, and I think this will, actually it was last year, my apologies. This will drastically simplify the implementation of this particular pattern, and I really encourage everyone to take advantage of that service when it comes out. So we move on to the next element, which is we know that we have to have these services configured, and we know that once they are configured, we want to make sure that that's maintained. Every single one of these services can be exclusively configured via CloudFormation or other templatized languages. So let's talk about how we maintain compliance and control. So the configuration of the service is great, but how do we manage the change? So all changes, whether it's directing the traffic to a new bucket, whether it's creating a new compliance service, whether it's adjusting the filter that applies to VPC flow logs, et cetera, all of those changes are exclusively defined in code. All of those changes are exclusively modified by submitting pull requests via Git. Now, many developers in every single organization are familiar with Git, and it's now become a very de facto standard for configuring your cloud landscape. But if you think about it, the developer or your compliance team is saying, I would like to redirect the logs, or I'd like to reconfigure the config service to be more aggressive or adjust the filters. They can basically state that intention. They can then request that change by submitting it into Git and raising what we call a pull request. Now, why is a pull request so important? Well, it's an atomic request, right? It exists at a point in time. It has a requester, an approver, it has a date stamp, it has comments, and most importantly, it gives you the ability to interrogate exactly the changes that are about to be applied, not introspect the changes after they've been made, which is a key difference. Multi-layered approval processes can then be applied, where you might have one team request a change, another team approve the change. So this is a very important technique that RHB and other financial services organizations have applied to help manage the change of those particular services. Now, just switching gears for 1 second, I'd like to talk about control planes and control options. So if we look at the cloud adoption framework that the Amazon professional services teams publish, and we look at the security perspective, we find 4 really specific control planes that we want to have a look at. So directive, detective, responsive, and preventative. I'd like to zoom in on 2 of them specifically today, which is both the detective framework and a directive framework. Now, we've heard Ali speak at length about how a detective framework can be an incredibly powerful enabler for allowing teams to build and innovate services with guardrails in place and to get near real-time compliance data and ensure in future that they'll be auto-remediated. A second way of achieving this, or a complementary technique for achieving this, is we also are able to define patterns that can be used by the organization. So let's take RHB's case. They had a number of services they'd like to configure, and they had all of the guardrails mapped out that they would like to map out, right? So what we're able to do is basically produce that as a blueprint or produce that as a template, which means every single developer for the rest of the organization that would like to reuse that service in a standardized way, were able to pull that template and to self-service that for their application. So let's say one team has built the Lambda, they've configured the Lambda, they've written the IAM policies, et cetera, et cetera. That now becomes a certified pattern. We've gone through the process of getting that certified by security, by compliance, by audit, by all of the relevant bodies that are applicable in your organization. And once that pattern is certified, it is now available for use wholesale for the entire organization at a self-service level for every single developer. It's an incredibly important pattern, and it's an incredibly important accelerant to build what I call organizational leverage, which is your ability to do things once and to multiply it n number of times. So once we have our certified pattern and the development teams are free to self-service, applications are compliant and secured by default. Now, this is through both planes. So we have our certified patterns, and we also have, as to Ali's description before, a set of guardrails that are constantly scanning that environment in real time to ensure compliance. And we could add more and more rules as we go along and make sure that we're keeping up with the latest and greatest standards as they're published by the regulatory body. Now, there's a third advanced technique that I'd like to show you today. I would caveat that this is fairly advanced, and it is at the upper end of the compliance landscape. How do I know if this chain's working? So I've got my certified pattern, and I've gone through my organizational process of getting that approved. The second thing is I've now got all of my detective rules scanning that environment in real time, hundreds of rules scanning every single minute, and I know they're working. But how do I test this? How do I make sure that both of those systems are working correctly? And how do I ensure that the corrective process is working as it should? So here comes the canary, right? And think about the canary in the coal mine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to intentionally provision an uncompliant resource that does not meet the compliance requirements of the organization. And I'm going to check that it gets automatically remediated within a prescribed SLA. So let's say I've got a guardrail that says every single RDS database must be encrypted at rest. I'm going to intentionally provision unencrypted databases, and I'm going to give the canary 5 minutes to make sure that that encryption gets enabled and meets the standards of the canary. And the canary's treating the entire system as a black box. It doesn't know how that remediation is happening. It doesn't care where that remediation is happening. It cares about the outcome of that encryption being enabled. So the canary is my fail-safe mechanism to ensure that my kill chain or my compliance chain is actually working. So the canary is a really, really advanced technique to basically go all the way through that landscape. So with that, I would like to hand back to the esteemed Ali, who can cover off some of the resources available to you in the Amazon environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Clara. It's great to see how our customers are using AWS services to innovate. So in addition to AWS services, at AWS, we have created other resources to help our customers integrate AWS within their control framework. One is AWS white papers. We have white papers for security, for compliance, specific for countries, and those are publicly available in our website. So we have some for Australia, for Singapore, India, and many other countries. We also have created AWS workbooks. So what is the difference between workbooks and white papers? For workbooks, we went through the regulations, so requirement by requirement. And for those requirements or controls that are AWS responsibility, we provide information about what are the controls that we have in place. Again, we have some specifics for Philippines, for Singapore, for India, and many others. And this is those workbooks are available in AWS Artifacts. So this is very useful for teams like compliance, risk, audit, because they don't need to contact our AWS representative anymore. They can just use their AWS account to download the documents. And the last resource I would like to talk about is AWS Compliance Center. Last year, we released AWS Compliance Center, which is a central repository, a central location, where you can research cloud-related regulations and how they impact your industry, your financial services industry. And next steps, a recap, and what I would love you to do to achieve continuous compliance, continuous assessment, and audit in AWS is first take the long checklist, long list of requirements that you have from the regulators, from the internal requirements. Don't panic. Now you are in the cloud, so you are not responsible for all the controls. So identify responsibilities. And for those controls that are AWS responsibility, use our resources, like those that we just discussed, AWS workbooks, to understand what we have already implemented, and for due diligence. For those that are customer responsibility, you need to define the control. So do you need a manual control, an automated control, detective, preventive? And use AWS services, those that give you visibility, login, monitoring, so you can see everything that is happening in your AWS environment. And use also those services that give you automation, so you can do things easier using AWS Lambda function or the auto remediation in config rules. And of course, you cannot expect to do everything in one day. So take control by control, feel comfortable, familiarize yourself with the platform, and then iterate. That's all from me. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the sessions. Thank you.